They told you the truth was eternal, untouchable, and beyond human interference. But what if I told you the church itself created an official blacklist, a list of books so dangerous to their control that they were banned outright, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by deliberate design, stamped and sealed in a centuries-long catalogue called the Index of Prohibited Books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a chilling record of fear, power, and manipulation that lasted for more than 400 years, an official list declaring what you could read, what you could think, what you could believe, and what you must never dare to question. And here is the real twist. This was not a rumor or a fringe conspiracy. It was a public decree signed by popes, enforced by inquisitors, and wielded like a weapon against scientists, reformers, philosophers, and ordinary men and women who simply wanted to seek the truth for themselves. So ask yourself, if truth is from God, why would they be so terrified of certain books? Why would they need to hide them, burn them, and threaten eternal damnation to those who read them? And what does that say about the foundation of everything you were taught to believe? Imagine the moment when a devout Catholic scholar discovered that a book he cherished, one filled with knowledge and insight, had been suddenly declared forbidden, suddenly turned into a sin, not because of what it proved, but because of what it threatened, and that threat was never to God but always to the monopoly of interpretation controlled by the Church. Can you see the strategy? Silence the voices that raise doubt, suppress the discoveries that contradict dogma, erase the thinkers that dare to reimagine the world, and by doing so, secure absolute obedience from the faithful. This was not about faith, it was about control, and when you realize that even great minds like Galileo and Descartes found themselves listed among the damned writings, the shocking reality dawns on you. The very institutions that claim to defend truth were the same ones locking it away, because if you ever read those books, you might start asking questions they could not answer. You might start wondering whether Jesus himself was used as a shield to cover up the fear of losing power. Do you feel that weight in your chest? That burning anger that something was taken from you? Not just stories or theories, but centuries of stolen voices, silenced ideas, and crushed possibilities. That is the shadow the Index cast over history, a shadow so dark it reached into universities, homes, and pulpits, dictating what was safe for your soul and what was dangerous for their authority. And here is where it gets even more disturbing. The list was not just for scholars, it was for everyone, meaning the Church believed even ordinary believers could not be trusted to discern truth for themselves. They were treated like children, spoon-fed only the doctrines that served the hierarchy, while entire libraries of knowledge were locked away. Do you feel the contradiction? A faith that preached freedom in Christ while chaining the minds of its people? A religion that told you God gave you reason but punished you for using it? This opening is only scratching the surface, because once we dive deeper into how the Index was created, why it expanded, and what books you would recognize today that were declared forbidden, you will never look at the words truth and tradition the same way again. Because buried inside this Index is the undeniable proof that knowledge was never the enemy, but control was. And once you see how far they went to protect that control, you will ask yourself the one question they always feared: what else are they hiding from me? Because the banned books were not accidents. They were carefully chosen, strategically condemned, and ruthlessly suppressed. And when you hear the names of those authors and the titles of those works, your jaw will drop, because you will realize you were never meant to read them, never meant to know them, never meant to think for yourself. And that is why this Index, this secret weapon of censorship, might be the most revealing document in the entire history of Christianity. And by the end of this journey, you will see why they tried so hard to bury it, but why its existence condemns their actions forever. And right now, as we begin, ask yourself, if God is truth, why would truth need protection from a book? Let that thought sit in your mind as we begin to unroll the hidden pages of history they hoped you would never see. Now let us strip back the curtains of time and stare directly into the moment when the Index was born, because nothing this extreme appears from nowhere. It emerges from fear, from panic, from desperation, to hold on to power when the world is slipping out of your control. And in the 16th century, that panic had a name: the printing press. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, words, ideas, and dangerous questions could spread faster than any priest could silence them. And the Church, that once monopolized knowledge by chaining manuscripts inside monasteries, now found itself staring at an unstoppable flood of books pouring into Europe, each one a potential spark of rebellion, each one a possible rival interpretation of God, of Jesus, of the Bible itself. So what did they do? They reached for the oldest trick in the arsenal of power, censorship, but not casual censorship, not the occasional condemnation of a troublesome work. Instead, they created an institution, a living mechanism of suppression called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, established in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, a catalogue meant to be updated, expanded, and enforced across the Catholic world. Imagine the arrogance of publishing a book that told millions of faithful people, "These are the works you are forbidden to read, because the very act of reading them endangers your soul." What kind of truth collapses under the weight of a page? What kind of faith fears a question? This was the dawn of a 400-year campaign of intellectual control, and when we peel back the motivations, we see how much this was less about faith and more about power. The Protestant Reformation had already cracked the monopoly of Rome. Martin Luther had nailed his theses, and his books were spreading like wildfire. Entire communities were questioning papal authority, salvation, indulgences, and suddenly the idea that ordinary people could hold a Bible in their own language became a threat bigger than any army. So Rome responded not with debate but with prohibition, not with persuasion but with intimidation. It was easier to label a book heresy than to answer its arguments. It was safer to forbid its reading than to risk losing the loyalty of the masses, and so the Index became their shield, their sword, their ultimate firewall against the uncontrollable storm of ideas that came with the modern age. But do not think for a second this was just about Protestant books. Oh no, the Index cut deeper. It targeted scholars within Catholicism itself, thinkers like Erasmus who dared to critique corruption, theologians who tried to expand understanding, scientists like Galileo, whose telescope turned heaven into a place of observable laws rather than mystical dogma. And each addition to the Index was another confession, a confession that the Church feared not Satan, not sin, but the liberation of the mind. Can you feel the irony? That the very institution claiming divine truth was terrified of human thought. And it did not stop there. The Index was enforced by the Congregation of the Holy Office, the same machinery that ran the Inquisition, meaning this was not a polite suggestion. This was law. Disobey, and you risked excommunication, imprisonment, or worse, burning. Entire print runs of books were seized and destroyed. Entire generations of potential ideas went up in flames because a few men in Rome decided they were too dangerous. And yet, here is the thought that cuts the deepest. The very books they tried to bury are the same books that shape the modern world, because you cannot silence truth forever. You can delay it, you can suppress it, but eventually it breaks through, and when it does, it exposes the fear of those who tried to hide it. So why would the Church risk so much? Why would they rather look like tyrants of thought than defenders of truth? The answer is brutal in its simplicity, control. If people could read Descartes and question the soul, if they could read Galileo and question the cosmos, if they could read Luther and question salvation, the Church lost its monopoly, and without that monopoly, the entire edifice of unquestioned obedience crumbled. So the Index was less about saving souls and more about saving power. And this is why history must be confronted, because the Index tells us in black and white what they feared most. Not demons, not devils, not paganism, but books. And you have to ask yourself, what does it say about an institution when paper and ink are treated like mortal threats? Does it not reveal weakness? Does it not show that perhaps the truth they claimed to guard was never as solid as they told you? And here is the haunting reflection. The Index was updated for centuries, each generation adding new names, new works, new ideas, as if the fear never ended, as if every new century produced yet another challenge they could not answer honestly. So instead of dialogue, they turned to censorship, and by the time the Index was finally abolished in 1966, millions of works had lived under its shadow, countless discoveries delayed, countless readers intimidated into silence. Can you feel the weight of that silence? Because it still echoes, and when you look at the early beginnings of this list, you realize it was not just a reaction to history, it was a premeditated strategy to stop people like you from asking questions, from challenging assumptions, from seeking knowledge beyond the pulpit, and that realization should make your blood boil, Because the same church that told you to trust its authority is the same one that for centuries told you not to trust your own eyes, your own reason, your own hunger for truth. And as we move forward into the next part, you will see exactly which books they were so terrified of that they declared them forbidden. And when you hear those names, your jaw will drop, because many of them are works you would never imagine the church tried to silence. Now comes the revelation that will shatter your assumptions, because it is one thing to know that the church banned books, but it is another thing entirely to hear which books were placed on the index, works that today you might recognize as the very foundation of modern thought, books you might even find in your local library or quoted in school classrooms. And yet for centuries, these very titles were declared sinful, forbidden, and dangerous. Imagine walking into a bookshop in the 17th or 18th century and seeing the names of Descartes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Galileo, or Darwin, and being told that to open those pages would imperil not just your reputation, but your eternal soul. What does that do to the mind of a believer? It creates fear. It makes curiosity itself a sin, and that is exactly how the index operated, by making the hunger for truth into an act of rebellion against God, when in reality it was only rebellion against the church's monopoly. Let us begin with one of the most famous examples, Galileo Galilei, the man whose telescope proved that the Earth revolved around the Sun, a discovery that shattered the ancient geocentric model the Church insisted was divinely revealed. Galileo's works, including his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, were placed firmly on the index, his voice silenced, his discoveries declared heresy, and yet today we all know he was right. So ask yourself, what does it mean when the Church preferred to silence truth rather than adapt to it? Does it not show that control mattered more than reality? Then there is Nicholas Copernicus, whose book, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, was likewise condemned. The very text that laid the groundwork for modern astronomy was banned for more than 2 centuries. Think about that. For over 200 years, the Church declared it sinful to read the truth about the solar system. And in those centuries, how many minds were denied the chance to see the universe as it really is? Then consider René Descartes, the philosopher whose famous Meditations and Principles of Philosophy carved out the foundation of modern rationalism. Banned. Why? Because Descartes dared to suggest that reason and observation could lead to truth independently of the Church, and that was intolerable, because if reason was enough, then what need was there for their authority? Can you feel the theme emerging? Every thinker who gave people tools to think for themselves was silenced. Every voice that encouraged independence of thought was gagged. Move forward into the Enlightenment, and it only gets worse. Voltaire, the fiery critic of superstition and defender of reason, his works filled the index. Rousseau, whose social contract spoke of freedom and sovereignty of the people. Forbidden. Montesquieu, who dared to suggest separation of powers and checks on authority. Banned. And even John Locke, whose ideas shaped democracy itself, placed on the index. Do you see the pattern? The very principles that created modern science, modern philosophy, and modern democracy were all once declared sins by the Catholic Church. What irony! The same people who claimed to guard morality tried to bury liberty. The same people who preached truth declared the greatest truths forbidden, and the censorship did not stop with philosophy or science. Even literature fell victim. Novels that questioned morality or depicted human struggle were condemned. Imagine reading Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, a story about justice, compassion, and redemption, and finding it on the index. Yes, even Hugo was not safe, and the absurdity deepens when you realize that even great works of art and literature were considered threats simply because they did not conform to rigid dogma. How many lives could have been changed, how many minds inspired, had the index not stood in the way? How many revolutions delayed, how many discoveries slowed, how many truths buried under centuries of fear? And here is the emotional punch. Think about the ordinary believer in the 19th century. Someone curious, someone devout, someone who loved God but also hungered for understanding. They walk into a library and see entire shelves of forbidden works. They hear whispers of new ideas, but they know that to read them is to risk their soul. Can you imagine the torment of being told that to seek knowledge is sin, that to use the very reason God gave you is rebellion? That is the cruelty of the index. It turned curiosity into guilt. It turned thought into danger. It chained the mind while pretending to save the soul. And when you look at the long list of banned works, you realize it was not just individuals being silenced, it was humanity itself being delayed. Because these books did not only belong to their authors, they belonged to all of us. And yet for centuries they were locked away, hidden, forbidden, burned and ridiculed, until eventually truth proved too powerful to contain. The heliocentric model became undeniable, democracy became inevitable, science became unstoppable, and the church had to slowly, grudgingly retreat. But the fact remains, for centuries it fought against the very truths that shaped our world. And when you hear this, when you realize the names on the index were the same names that created modernity, you cannot help but feel the weight of betrayal, because you were taught that the church defended truth, when in reality it defended control. And the index is the smoking gun, the undeniable proof that suppression was more important to them than enlightenment. So I ask you, what kind of truth needs protection from a book? What kind of faith collapses under the weight of a page? And what does it mean for you today, knowing that the very foundation of the world you live in was once considered heresy? In the next part, we will go deeper into the hidden side of censorship, the enforcement, the punishments, the fear, and the underground networks of readers who risked everything to access the forbidden. And once you hear how far they went to keep these books from you, you will understand just how much power they believed was at stake. Now we step into the shadows of enforcement, into the chilling world where the index was not just a list, but a weapon, because a decree is only as powerful as the fear it inspires and the punishments it enforces. And the Catholic Church understood this with terrifying precision. The index was policed by the Congregation of the Holy Office, the same body that ran the Inquisition, which means that reading the wrong book was not simply a private matter of conscience, it was a potential crime. Against God and against Rome, imagine living in that world where a book in your home could be enough to condemn you, where lending a copy to a friend could land you before inquisitors, where curiosity itself could be twisted into rebellion. This was not metaphorical suppression. This was real, enforced by inspections, denunciations, and the looming threat of excommunication, imprisonment, or even death. Entire shipments of books were seized at borders, libraries were raided, publishers forced to shut down, and in some cases books were burned publicly as a warning. Can you see the flames rising, the pages curling, the ideas screaming in silence as they were reduced to ash? And here is the brutal irony. The church claimed that fire purified the soul, but in reality it was fire that destroyed the light of knowledge. And yet, even with the fear, there were always those who resisted, underground networks of readers and thinkers who risked everything to circulate forbidden texts. Secret reading circles where men and women whispered over banned pages, risking denunciation, but refusing to surrender their hunger for truth. What courage does it take to read a book when you know it could cost you your life? That is the testament to the human spirit that the index could never extinguish. But think also of the countless others who were silenced, scholars forced into recantations, thinkers broken under interrogation, voices lost forever because the church decided their words were too dangerous, entire generations of knowledge stifled. And for what? To protect the fragile authority of men in robes who feared being questioned. And here is a thought you cannot ignore. Every time a book was banned, every time a reader was silenced, the church revealed what it truly feared. It was never Satan, it was never heresy in the abstract. It was the loss of monopoly over the narrative of Jesus, over the interpretation of Scripture, over the claim to be the only gatekeepers of truth. That is why they struck so hard, because the moment people realized they could seek knowledge outside the pulpit, the illusion of absolute power cracked, and so the index became a wall, not of protection, but of suppression. And you must feel the cruelty of that wall, because it was not just built against ideas, it was built against you, against the possibility that you might think, reflect, and see through the facade. And yet there is another layer of irony, because even within the church there were priests, bishops, even cardinals who secretly read the banned works, who hid copies in private libraries, who whispered their insights quietly while condemning them publicly, a theater of obedience masking a secret thirst for knowledge. What does it say about authority when its own enforcers break its rules? Does it not expose the hypocrisy at the core, that the very men who warned the faithful of damnation were often the ones reading the forbidden words in private? That the index was less about protecting souls and more about maintaining appearances, but appearances backed by violence are no less deadly. And across Europe, the shadow of the index stretched into universities, censoring syllabuses, restricting lectures, and ensuring that entire generations of students graduated without ever hearing the names of thinkers. We now consider essential pause and imagine the weight of those lost centuries, centuries where questions were not asked, where discoveries were not shared, where progress slowed to a crawl because a few men in Rome decided humanity was not ready. But who gave them that right? Who granted them the authority to decide what your eyes could see, your ears could hear, your mind could process? The truth is, no one did. They seized it, they enforced it, and they dressed it up as divine will. And yet, buried in the records of history, you can still hear the voices of those who resisted, who smuggled books, who read by candlelight in secret, who whispered truths in defiance of silence. And when you realize the courage it took for them to defy the Index, you understand that freedom of thought was not handed to you. It was fought for. It was preserved by rebels of the mind who refused to bow, and their defiance became the seed of every modern freedom you now enjoy. But do not be fooled into thinking this battle is over, because though the Index was officially abolished in 1966, the spirit of censorship still lingers. The same fear of uncontrolled truth still pulses in institutions that prefer obedience over liberation. And as you consider the flames of those burned books, you must ask yourself, what truths are still being withheld? What ideas are still being branded dangerous? What knowledge is still being silenced under different names? Because history has shown us one chilling fact. The Church feared books not because they were false, but because they had the power to reveal truth, and the Index stands as their confession of that fear. In the final part, we will confront its collapse, the admission that the Index had become indefensible, and the haunting implications that even without it, the instinct to control truth has never died. And now we come to the final act, the collapse of the Index, the moment when, after more than 4 centuries of fear, control, and suppression, the Church finally admitted what the world had long known, that the Index Librorum Prohibitorum was no longer defensible, that it had become a grotesque relic of authoritarian control in an age of growing freedom, and yet even in its death, it left behind scars, because the official abolition of the Index in 1966 was not an admission of guilt. It was a quiet concession to reality. The world had moved on, science had advanced, democracy had flourished, and the Enlightenment ideals that once filled the forbidden list had become the very foundation of modern society, so the Church had no choice but to retreat. But here is the part that should make your blood run cold. Even as they abolished it, they made clear that Catholics were still morally obligated to avoid the books that had once been listed, meaning the spirit of censorship remained even. After the machinery was dismantled, and that spirit reveals something crucial, the instinct to control truth has never died. It only changes form. So let us reflect on what the end of the Index truly meant. It was not simply a bureaucratic adjustment. It was the quiet confession that for 4 centuries the Church had fought a losing war against knowledge, a war that delayed discoveries, silenced voices, and chained humanity's progress. Think of the generations robbed of access to Galileo's astronomy, Descartes' philosophy, Rousseau's political vision, or Darwin's science. Centuries where countless ordinary believers were kept in intellectual darkness, convinced that curiosity was rebellion, when in fact their very faith should have encouraged them to seek, to question, to discover if God is truth. Then why fear truth? That is the contradiction that the Index exposes, and its very existence is proof that the Church feared not heresy, but irrelevance, feared not lies, but questions, feared not Satan, but freedom. And when you see that, you realize this story is not just about the past, it is about today. Because censorship never disappears, it only reinvents itself. Even now, institutions, governments, and organizations find ways to suppress inconvenient truths, to bury uncomfortable questions, to label dissent as dangerous. The Index may be gone, but the mindset of the Index still lingers. So what does this mean for you? It means you must never forget that truth needs no protection. Truth is not fragile. Truth does not collapse under the weight of a page. Only lies do. Only fragile authority does. And when you hear that the Church once declared the greatest minds of human history forbidden, you cannot help but feel the weight of betrayal, because this was not a defense of faith. It was a war against freedom, and that war shaped the very world you live in. The legacy of the Index is not just in the books it banned, but in the suspicion it sowed, the fear it cultivated, the control it exercised. But there is also another legacy, the resistance, the men and women who defied it, who risked everything to read, to think, to question. Their courage is the reason we live in a world where knowledge is freer than ever. Their defiance is the reason we can look back at the Index not as an eternal victory of suppression, but as a failed experiment in silencing humanity. And yet the final haunting question remains: if they banned so many books in plain sight, what else did they hide in the shadows? What texts were destroyed before they could ever be read? What manuscripts suppressed before they reached the public? What truths erased before they could challenge authority? The Index is both a list and a warning. It tells us not only what they banned, but also what they feared, and fear is the true confession of power. So let this sink in. The very institution that told you to trust it unconditionally is the same institution that for 4 centuries did not trust you with a book. Let that contradiction burn in your mind. Let it stir your anger, let it fuel your hunger for truth, because the lesson of the Index is clear. Never surrender your right to question. Never surrender your right to read. Never surrender your right to think. Because once you do, you are no longer free. You are only obedient, and obedience without truth is slavery of the soul. So here is the crushing conclusion. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum may have ended in 1966, but its shadow stretches across history as a monument to fear, hypocrisy and control, and the only way to honor those who risked everything to defy it is to never again allow any institution to decide what you can or cannot know. If this truth already shook you, imagine what comes next, because the story of the Church's hidden history is far from over, and every week we peel back another layer, another lie, another cover-up they never wanted you to see. So subscribe now, because you will not want to miss the next revelation. And together we will keep unmasking the truths they tried so hard to bury.